The RaceKraft 3041 quads actually snuck up on me. I didn't even see that they had come out after the tris had released, but we certainly have to put them up against the tri and the RotorX and see how they fare as well. From the outset, I didn't have a lot of hope for them. They look very similar to the tri, and we'd already seen the results from that in the previous test, and I'm pretty iffy about. But if you really examine the blades closely, they are actually quite different. The quad has a much more pronounced shoulder. It's got a thinner tip out at the end and less overhanging on the trailing edge. And you can see from the results that we definitely get a very, very different picture with this quad blade. The weight is a little more, 1.8 grams, not the end of the world, but the RPM that we hit was quite a bit higher than the RPM of either the triblade or the RotorX tri. So the motor is obviously under much less load. The prop is a lot less aggressive, and we're getting more thrust out of it. 282 grams peak thrust, still not as much as the RotorX. We've got another 40 gram lead on the rest of it there, but it's still a nice amount more than the 3076 tri. And because we're under less load that we're seeing from our higher RPM, and with more thrust with the power input, you can see 10.4 amps, 127 watts, by far the lowest watt draw out of all three, even though it's a quad blade. You know, you'd think, oh, quad blade less efficient. This one beats the tri, beats the RotorX, and down at our thrust at 100 watts, 210 grams, which is more than the RotorX. So although our peak power is not nearly as high, because this has so much more efficiency at lower than peak, we're actually getting a fairly decent amount more thrust for the same amount of power input on that quad blade RaceKraft than we are even on our old standby, the RotorX tri. So looking at the test program results, we've got the same lineup that we had before in the last test. RaceKraft triblade in red, the RotorX in green, and we've added now the new RaceKraft quad in blue. And you can see we're making still just a little bit more power. The RotorX has a large lead over most of this stuff. And interesting, you can see down in the lower ranges that the triblade, the aggressive 3076, is actually taking a lead in about the first half of the throttle range. It makes a little bit more thrust compared to the quad. And then as the throttle range goes up, the quad takes a lead where the triblade starts to struggle a little bit. If we look at just the straight up thrust of the prop, the quad blade makes lower power at every RPM along the range. But because it's a lesser load, that means the motor can spin faster, and so we end up making up a lot of that back. So you can see where the RaceKraft triblade ran out of steam, we still were able to push past that and make more absolute power in the end, even though at the same RPM we were making less. And of course, a really interesting one that we could tell from the single stats earlier, looking at the efficiency of the prop over its whole power range, this RaceKraft quad blade beats out all of the others at all power levels. So everywhere that this RaceKraft makes power, it's doing it more efficiently than the RotorX and way more efficiently than the triblade. Although it's more efficient, we're making more power at equivalent power levels. Because we're not spinning fast enough, we still have a deficit in peak power. You know, here, this is our peak power that we got out of it, and we're getting there more efficiently, but we're still below where it is there. But this might be an excellent candidate for running at higher KV. The efficiency is still really good. We're not running out of power, we're running out of RPM on the motor. And because obviously we're hitting a lot lower load on the motor, we can increase the KV, which will increase the load and get us more power, and we still get to keep all of this efficiency down on the low end. Looking at the efficiency across the RPM band of the prop, I thought it was kind of neat to see the RaceKraft here actually hits its peak a lot later than either of the others. The RotorX peak efficiency at its best is higher than the others, but that's coming only like 7,500 RPM or so. There's not a ton of power down that low. The RaceKraft 3041 is hitting almost at about 10,000 RPM, so that's about the lower third. Still not really a ton of action down there, but it was a really clear trend. And then obviously, as we go into the higher RPMs, the efficiency of both of the other props drop off a lot faster, and the RaceKraft maintains its efficiency lead until all the way at the very end, when it finally, at its very, very peak, matches what the RotorX triblade is managing. Interesting though, also, you can see that through the very top end of the RPM band, the RotorX prop feels like it's really plateaued. It's not losing a ton of efficiency as it's spinning faster there, while both of the RaceKraft props feel like they're on a very similar kind of curve. The quad blade is more efficient, but it's still kind of falling at the same rate. And so although it crosses over there, we can kind of anticipate that we haven't really peaked out the efficiency of, or haven't really plateaued the efficiency of this prop yet. And as we spin it faster, the peak efficiency is probably going to continue to drop a little more from there. Now, if we look at the acceleration, because it's a little harder to judge on the acceleration, particularly the braking, because the speeds are different, because the motor is under so much less of a load. But you can see in this acceleration part of the test, in absolute terms of acceleration, it's just about the same, but because we're going to a higher RPM, it takes a little longer for it actually to hit its target. If it was hitting the target in the same amount of time, we would have to have more acceleration out of the prop, because it needs to travel a further distance to hit the target speed. So the absolute acceleration is just about the same, but since we're going to a higher RPM, it takes us a little longer to hit that set point. And then if we look at the actual peak acceleration numbers, pretty close to where the triblade was hitting, and we're still accelerating faster than the RotorX is. The lighter load on the prop, despite having more weight, the lighter load on the prop is definitely giving us an advantage here in acceleration.